Um, how that would work
Plus,
logistically, don't know, but
plus the current chair who oversees the
yes,
process, Ambassador Luis Valleda, is from Ecuador.
yes, yeah. Just infrastructurally, I'm not sure how Galapagos would work. So anyway,
You could
I
also
don't know.
you could also argue a sustainability issue. A lot, I think, member states would argue sustain having that many people would be a sustainability and harm of habitat issue.
And I think there would be a bit of an optics question as well. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So Fitria will be the lead technical officer for 2 days. Not me. I will have to leave the Zoom meeting again. But Fitria and
Oh
Amarashin
no.
is here. So yeah, I think we will now welcome the participants and feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and then welcoming remarks by Her Excellency Shelan Saling as usual for 2 minutes. So Shelan, you may have the floor before we start with Miss Alex.
Well, thank you, Principal Advisor of Virtual Affairs to CYMG. I will, unfortunately, Alex has to leave a bit early today. So I will just hand it off to Alex and we'll begin.
Thank you very much. And by a bit early, I just mean 15 minutes. So we'll be finishing not at half past, it would be, let's see, 4:30 UTC, but we'll be finishing around 4:15 at least with me. I do apologize, but if there are questions that do come up and we don't get to answer them, obviously they'll be held over for Saturday. And if you want to post them directly to me, that's absolutely fine as well. So welcome all of you. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're all having a good week. I can't believe it's almost the end of our week 3 sessions, which is shocking to me, but we still have one more week, so we'll treasure all of this time together. Um, all right, I now have my shared screen, so this is good. I'm going to move one thing over here. I'm still getting used to using 2 screens. You'd think at this point in my life I would, but no. Anyway, so today we are going to continue our discussion about treaty negotiations quite generally. And then as a reminder, next week we're going to transition over to a case study. And the case study will be near and dear to certainly my heart, to certainly the hearts of most people here from CYMG, and that is to say, it is on the plastics treaty itself. So we'll be talking a great deal more about that. And for the moment, we will call it the plastics treaty. Now, we just had a discussion about who gets to name it, and the how, and all of this process. So whatever its final name will be remains to be seen, but we're going with the plastics treaty. Um, so as a reminder
Sorry,
from Tuesday, yeah.
before you continue, could you do the thing where you change the screen again?
Oh yes, I'm so sorry. Thank you, Amanda. There you go.
Don't
Is that
worry.
better?
Perfect. Yes, yes.
Okay, good. Good, 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 good. Yes. So for today, a reminder that what we were supposed to learn this week, hopefully what you've learned at least partially or part of. So essentially all the background and all the information you need on at least a surface understanding of what goes on in a treaty negotiation. So the essential elements, things like how you get there, what are the visa requirements, what are the seating requirements, all of these things that are essential and also logistical information. As well as things like the rules of procedure, which we talked about a great deal, and we'll certainly talk about a great deal more next week. So we've already touched on all of these. And now we're going to get into a bit more of the idea of the phases of the negotiation, which we touched on last week, or pardon me, last session. Every day feels like a very long time in the world of negotiating treaties. Anyway, and then we'll talk about the terminology that is used because there are terms that are completely different, completely foreign, and they may actually be words you know, but the way that they're used in that context is very different. So we'll talk about that as well, and also just the idea of what negotiation practice looks like, and then also how you can be directly involved. So how how groups, how civil society groups, et cetera, have the ability to be directly involved. But before we get to that, there were some lingering questions from Tuesday that I wanted to address. And so the first one was a question that I think is very important to get to, and that is it possible for an individual to attend a treaty negotiation? And I added in there by extension a COP or a conference of the parties, etc. Um, and unfortunately, the short answer is no. So if you are just going as you, if I'm just going as myself, wanting to go into a treaty negotiation, I would have a problem. Similarly, I would have a problem for a COP, because when we are thinking about who can be in the room and who is allowed in, there has been a decision made by most UN processes that this has to be a person who is um, the representative, or at least a representative or affiliated with an organization that is accredited with the United Nations, either with the General Assembly or with UNEP itself or some of the other bodies, depending on the type of treaty or being negotiated or being implemented. So you can't just walk in and say, I'm interested, I'm an individual, I want to attend. Likewise, you can't if you go on to Indico, which is the website for registration that many of us all know and have mixed feelings about. If you go on there and you try to register as an individual to attend, you will typically not be allowed to do so because you have to be affiliated with an entity that has accreditation. That said, for many of you, if you are students, even if you're graduate students, or perhaps recent alumni who might still maintain connections with your schools, a lot of universities are now starting to have accreditation with the General Assembly and with UNEP. So it is often possible for you to attend under the accreditation of your university. So if you're looking for a way in and you don't quite know how, that is one way. Obviously, I would also suggest you talk to CYMG because they certainly are very active in this. But I think it's important to know that the individual cannot just walk in and go to a negotiation. So that was one really important question. The other one, which I thought was really interesting, is based on your experience, what are the major challenges when it comes to treaty negotiations, and also how does geopolitical interest influence environmental treaty negotiations? I think it does a great deal. I think we see this frequently. Geopolitical shifts, geopolitical tensions, theoretically, we would hope wouldn't come into a room because we're negotiating a plastics treaty and not a peace treaty for other conflicts, not an extension of things that happened at other conferences of the parties, for example. But we do see it come in. So we see tensions between states coming in when there is a conflict. We also see many times that what happens before a negotiation in terms of other conferences of the parties that might meet or other negotiations that might be happening can actually influence by carrying over many issues a treaty negotiation itself. So as an example for this, what we saw in Busan for the plastics treaty is that a number of issues like financing, like the role of fossil fuels, et cetera, that were very much debated in Busan actually reflected a number of the different arguments and points that were raised and not necessarily settled in the several conferences of the parties for different treaties that took place before Busan. So this year was quite exceptional, and I think I mentioned this last time on Tuesday that we had a conference of the parties in October for Convention on Biological Diversity. Then we had the Conference of the Parties in November for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we also knew that the Conference of the Parties was coming for a UN Convention on Desertification and Drought after the INC. And a lot of the tensions that we saw, for example, that led to a requirement to have a resumed session of the CBD, the Biological Diversity COP, also played a role coming into discussions in Busan. So we do see these carry over. It's a really great question, and I think it's also important to know that for framing purposes when we're thinking about what goes on in a negotiation. Um, in terms of what are the major challenges, I think there are many, and that could probably be a whole different discussion. But I do think a lot of them have to do with looking at the larger context. So not just looking at what we're trying to negotiate a treaty for in terms of it being like a separate entity, a plastics treaty, for example, but being part of the international system and understanding where those stresses come from. And we'll get back, I think, more to that next week, but it's a really great and very timely question. Let's see. The other question I thought was really interesting from Tuesday was what happens if negotiations fail to reach a result? Well, we've kind of seen this twice recently. Actually, well, three times, but twice in the treaty body negotiation context, and then once in a COP context. So we will be having, as we know, a resume session, so 5.2 for the ANC process, and that essentially is what would happen. We've also seen this in the context of trying to create the science policy panel to address issues of plastic, no, well, plastic, yes, but larger pollution and hazardous waste to make it the equivalent of the IPCC or the IPBES. That was scheduled theoretically to have been concluded last year, last June, but it was also continued over because there wasn't an agreement. And so now it will be continued and hopefully settled this June in another negotiation round. So this is typically what happens. If negotiations fail, they will continue into a next round. They will have something like a procedural requirement for an adjournment, and they will do that and continue over. That is typically how it works. We don't usually say, okay, you only get 5 meetings, that's it, then you're done. And if you don't reach it, well, too bad. You typically, there's a way to continue on, and we just continue negotiations until we do ultimately get to a result. And then also there was a question from last time that I just wanted to make sure I again got to quickly, and that is this question of regional organizations and the EU and their representation at treaty negotiations. So two things. First of all, quickly to remember that the European Union is a supranational organization, not technically a regional organization. So it has a certain amount of sovereignty vested in it from its member states. It can speak on its own for its member states. When it votes, it has the ability to vote for all of the member states who are present in the negotiations process. At the same time, all of the members of the EU do have the ability to speak on their own, and many of them do. So you will see the representatives from the EU speaking, as well as, for example, representatives from France or Belgium, etc., if they so wish. So that is within their purview, but they only get one vote. So that vote is typically done through the EU context. Regional organizations such as the African Union or the Organization of American States or ASEAN um, do not necessarily play a role in this. That we have geographic regions that meet to decide on whether they will have common stances, but those are not technically allied with or part of the regional organizations themselves. The regional organizations themselves, if they wanted to be present, would have to be accredited as observers and would have to be accredited in the same way that you would see, for example, a UN agency being accredited. So I just wanted to stress that because I think it's a really important point. Before we move on to our early discussions of specialized terminology, if we start to see Shellen like inadvertently twitching at any point, we'll know why. And Shellen, there's an Easter egg in this presentation for you, a little hidden gem photo
Oh
for you, because
no. Oh no.
most of these are photos I have taken throughout the various iterations of my recent travels for these things. So this was again in Busan. Come back to Busan here. So our specialized terminology begins, as do all of our meetings, with the idea of a plenary. I think I mentioned this last time, but a plenary is a very formal way of saying a meeting of all of the delegates to a negotiation or a conference of the parties, etc. It is when everyone comes together in the same room. We all talk, we all have the same exchanges back and forth. Typically in a negotiations process, this means all the states that are participating, as well as members of the observers and stakeholders groups who are present. So we all come together into the same very big room, which is what you're seeing there. And we sit in seats that are of questionable comfort, and we address things typically more formal and typically more high level. I realize I have the boring coffee mug today. I'm sorry. I will have to find a better, more entertaining travel one next time. So things like setting the agenda for the meeting, things like electing members of a bureau or members of any type of governance function will be done in plenary. When we ultimately get to voting for a treaty text, adopting a treaty text, etc., that will be done in plenary. Anything that typically requires a vote or at least a lack of dissent for it to progress onwards is done in plenary. And the contact groups, which we'll get to momentarily, have the ability to refer things to plenary. So refer an issue that may come up to the larger group for discussion and debate and hopefully guidance. The plenary, however, as I explained last time, also then typically leads into the use of contact groups. And contact groups are, I mean, it sounds like a breakout room. It sounds like some type of strange networking event. In a way, it is, in the sense that the contact groups are given a mandate. So, for example, again, to use plastics, a focus, and we'll talk about these more, but a focus on things relating to financing and governance, et cetera, on one hand, versus the core obligations and definitions of things like chemicals and primary plastic polymers, et cetera, on the other. So different contact groups established to look at different issues. Once we have a negotiating text, then we start going on the negotiating text and saying, okay, these articles go to you, these articles go to you. You discuss them in your sessions, and the sessions are typically held concurrently. We've had some technical issues with some of the recent discussions in rooms, but typically separate rooms. And they are often for like 3-hour blocks at a time. This is pretty much standard across multiple treaty processes. Um, with the idea that this is where the negotiation really happens. This is where countries make their views known. It's where they make textual proposals, as well as being able to upload them onto a system. It's where, when we start to winnow down the text to a few options, textual edits will be made on the screen and people can make comments. So this is where the bulk of the work happens. Sometimes we also see the idea of subgroups. So if it's a particularly large mandate given to a contact group, they might break it down further into subgroups and say that this group will meet in the morning, this will meet in the afternoon, etc. Um, I should point out here, there has been a push, and I did mention this, I think, last time as well, to limit certainly how late some of the sessions go, but also the number of contact groups or subgroups meeting at the same time. So in typical practice now, the effort is to have only 2 contact groups or subgroups meeting at the same time. Um, on the idea that typically many countries are only able to send 1 to 2 representatives and delegates, and that having multiple 3, 4, et cetera, contact groups running at the same time would mean that many countries would be precluded from attending all of them and participating in all of them, which is inherently unfair and inherently goes against the ideas that we have of sovereignty as well as equity, etc. So we do try to make sure that there are only 2 contact groups running at any time. There is always a push to make sure that at least until the last day or two, we only go until around 10 p.m. That is sometimes observed more in the breach, but again, it's an effort. Now, the idea of observers and stakeholders we have touched on already, but just to reiterate that observers and stakeholders, typically, certainly in UN processes, are those that are officially accredited. So they are organizations or international organizations or intergovernmental organizations or civil society members. You'll hear all of these terminologies used. They are not states. They do not represent states. Uh, Typically, although there is an exception, we'll talk about that in a second, but they typically don't represent states. They don't have votes, but they do have the right to be present, and they do have the ability to participate in certainly in the opening plenaries and where there is time in the contact groups. They typically will participate after the states, so they will speak afterwards if there is time. And they will have the ability to put in written statements, etc., on websites so they can be read as well. But they are non-state actors, typically. And I say typically because sometimes a state will have ratified, or probably will have signed a treaty. They will not have ratified it for domestic reasons. They will not have been able to get it passed. And they will have the option then of participating as an observer. So they won't be able to vote. They won't be able to speak with the rest of the countries in the room. They will have to wait until we get to the observers afterwards, but they will have the ability to do that. And we do see that sometimes, for example, in the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention context, where the United States is not a member of all 3 of these because it has not been able to ratify all 3. So it will go back and forth in its role between being a state party where appropriate and then also being an observer where appropriate. So that is one thing just to highlight. The concept of an INC is something that we all just assume is there, we know is there, but I should remind everyone that an INC is a formal acronym, as we all love acronyms, for the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. This is not something that is only for the plastics context, although we will talk about it in that way next week when we're using this as a case study. This is a typical acronym and terminology that is used whenever, say, UNEP or UNEA, well, UNEA and then UNEP, or authorize the negotiation of a treaty. We set out on this long process by using an intergovernmental negotiating committee. This terminology refers to the group of states that wish to come together and participate in the negotiation for whatever treaty this might be. There is no requirement for states to be part of the INC. They can say, no, we don't have the time, we don't have the resources, we can't do it, there's no interest, whatever, we're not going to be a participant, that's fine. That is within their right to do so. And should there be a treaty adopted out of the INC process, any country then has the ability to sign on to it. So just because you've opted not to be part of the INC process as a state does not mean you are precluded from joining. You're able to join later on. You're able to accede later on and then go through the ratification processes at home. It just means you don't have the joy and the heartache and the agony of being part of the negotiation process. And it means that, for example, if you have a very strong viewpoint you want to share or concern you want to share, obviously you're not able to do so. But you are not precluded from becoming a member later on. Um, Likewise, if you are part of the INC, if you're a state that's part of the INC, and then you're not able to ratify the result of the INC at home as a treaty, you will not be considered a state party to the treaty, even if you help to negotiate it. So just a few really fine points there for details. Now, Shellen, don't look. You'll start to like scream. Pay attention
Ah!
to the exactly. You only pay attention to this lovely visual here at the very end. So other specialized terminology. The chair or the chairs typically refers to the chair of the negotiating process. Typically, it is one person only. I put this in brackets here as a possible chairs because sometimes you have a system, as we have for the plastics treaty, where there are two chairs throughout the life cycle of the INC process. So, in the plastics context, again, we'll talk about this more later, but because it was difficult to get a decision on which country would be the holder of the chair, there was actually a negotiated solution, which was that the chair would rotate between a representative from one country for the first three, and then a representative from another, Ecuador, as we just mentioned, for what we thought would be the last two, and really it is just extra sessions of the last two. Um, that is more unusual. Typically, we will see one chair, but sometimes there can be two, hence the chairs. Um, Other terminology, co-chairs. Co-chairs typically will refer to those who are chairing the contact groups. And usually, contact groups are chaired by two people who are representatives of different countries. And there's usually an effort to have a gender balance as well as a geographical balance. Um, so, for example, one of the longstanding groups in the contact group leaderships in the negotiation processes is one that is in the plastics treaty context co-chaired by the representative from Ghana and the representative from Australia. The other is co-chaired by a representative from Germany and also Palau, who recently was joined because it was a very complex issue. Recently was joined also by a representative from Kuwait as well as the other co-chair. Um, when we get to things like facilitators and co-facilitators, these are people who typically are facilitating or co-facilitating the subgroups, so the subcontact groups. And they serve very much a similar function, but the kind of the reporting hierarchy goes from the facilitators to report to the co-chairs who then report to the chair. And again, they will be country representatives, all of them. Which brings us to this lovely text in front of you, right? And the lovely text in front of you that you will be seeing is from the compilation draft for the Plastics Treaty, the international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. Don't worry, that will, I guarantee you, not be the final title. Um, what I want you to see here is that in addition to bringing back so many memories, if you look at any of these parts, and this is only a partial table of contents, but it's to give you the idea, you will see that there are a number of words and some numbers as well that have brackets around them. And some have sub brackets. And if we were to actually go into the whole text, you would see multiple brackets on brackets on brackets. The use of brackets or the reference to bracketed text means that there is a textual proposal that has been made, but there is no agreement on it. So a country may put in a proposal for a certain text, for example, to include principles, but other countries may not agree. There may be dissent, and so there is not an ultimate agreement on it at any point, any given point in the history of negotiations. So rather than trying to pick different colors and remember what they mean or kind of put notations like, Germany says no, Canada says yes, instead what we do is we just use the brackets. So if you hear a reference to bracketed text, it means text that has not yet been agreed to, although it has been proposed by at least one country. And sometimes you will see text that has bracketed text that has brackets within it. So, for example, if you look at part 1 and you look at 4, where it says principles, there's a bracket around the entire thing because there are some countries that don't agree that principles should be included. There are some that do. And then within the principles, there was at least one state, in this case, several, to propose that this be not only called principles, but that it actually be called principles and approaches. But because not everyone agreed with this, that also went into brackets. Um, as you may imagine, and as you may see just looking down the rest of the table of contents before you, this can lead to a great deal of difficulty in making certainly linguistic and also legal sense of a lot of what we have in these types of texts because you're trying to figure out which part of the brackets connect to which. There is an art to doing it. It is a subtle art and it takes many years to perfect, and I can't say that I fully have. But when we are seeing bracketed text, that is the terminology and what it is referring to. And no, there is no limit on how many brackets can be in a document. And the compilation document for the Plastics Treaty, again, we'll talk about more next week, but has, has thousands of brackets. So they're all dear to our hearts. Moving on to the other concepts here, we have something called the zero draft. So the zero draft is actually the first effort, first iteration of a negotiated text, whether it is for a treaty, whether it is for a very contentious COP decision or an effort to have an annex or an amendment, etc. We will often see references to a zero draft. Now, usually we think that you would start out with a first draft. And most of us do when we're writing papers and we're doing things like that. But for the international context, the zero draft is the very first offering. It is where we are starting from. And so that is why we're calling it a zero draft. It typically is a compilation of textual proposals that have been made, comments that have been made about how things should be structured, et cetera, in a treaty. And there is an understanding from the beginning that it will not necessarily be reflected in the final document per se. Some of the headings will, the structure may be, but many of the terms and the contents will change dramatically. But it is the initial starting point for the negotiation of the actual text rather than just talking about what should go into it. A compilation document, like the one we just saw the table of context for, contents for, is a reference to typically a document that comes after the zero draft and is literally a compilation of all of the suggestions made by the parties, either in written form or in spoken interventions or both throughout a negotiation session, or sometimes we'll see the use of things like questionnaires in advance of a negotiation session, and then we'll see the results of those questionnaires put into a compilation document. So it's literally just bringing everything together and putting it there, typically with a set of options, multiple options, sub options, etc., to indicate who has proposed what. But the names of the countries proposing will not be put in these documents because we're trying to distance the idea of associating things with certain countries and making it a much more global discussion. And then we get to the information or the inf documents. Again, everything has an acronym. Inf documents are information documents that are issued typically by the Secretariat. So if we're looking at a negotiation, it's the negotiation secretariat. If we're looking at a conference of the parties, it's the Secretariat for the particular treaty regime. And these are documents that are intended to serve as guidance. Often they're documents that have been created by the Secretariat with the assistance of an outside consultant or outside expertise. And they tend to focus on both substantive and also procedural questions or issues that may come up, and often do things like provide a survey of what other treaty regimes have done, what other treaty negotiation processes have done in terms of a particular question, so that everyone can come into the negotiations with at least a background on this and trying to level the playing field in case you have a country that doesn't have a great deal of time and resources to put into doing this type of research. These are not official proposals. They are not proposals for decision text. They are not supposed to contain proposals for potential text for a treaty. They are merely meant to be informational throughout their context. Now, the non-paper is something that I get asked questions about all the time because it's come up in the recent plastics treaty context, and because many people come to me and go, I have this piece of paper in my hand. It has writing on it and it has a proposal. It's called a non-paper. How is it called a non-paper? It exists. It's printed out on paper. A non-paper is something that is not an official document. So it is not an official document. It has not been requested by the state parties to a negotiation or as part of the Conference of the Parties. It has not been officially released by the Secretariat as an inf document. It is something that is offered either by the chair in the context of, for example, the Plastics Treaty, as an effort to move things forward, or for example, by various countries if they're trying to offer suggestions for ways to move things forward, or what certain proposals might look like, what certain ideas and options might look like, then these are called non-papers. And they are put out for general information, for suggestion and potential usage, but they don't have any legal authorization in the sense that they weren't requested by the Conference of the Parties or by the INC itself, and they weren't put out by the Secretariat. This leads to a slightly different topic, and that is the conference room papers, the CRPs. CRPs are papers that are produced. Sometimes they have textual elements, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're just informational or background, but they are released during the negotiation themselves. And they are released typically by the parties. So typically one party or a group of parties will come together, states will come together and will make these proposals or put out this bit of information. It will be uploaded on the websites of the negotiating process, and it will be available for the public as a conference room paper and a suggestion and perhaps a talking point. So if you hear reference to CRPs, that is what they are. And I think that is enough explanation as to all the different ways we can talk about a proposal through various nomenclature. But there are subtle differences, especially in terms of legal authorization and whether it's a proposal for text or just a general proposal. That's why I put you all through having to hear about this. A few other things just to know in terms of terminology. A point of order is something that can be called at any point by a member state to question, under the rules of procedure, to question whether something is being done correctly, whether either a state or the secretariat or the chair is acting appropriately. And that always gets priority. So if you're in the middle of say a plenary and we have a long queue of states who are in line to speak, but a member state raises a point of order rather than being in line to speak about a topic, that will always get priority and that will always be immediately addressed, because it is a question of how the meeting is being conducted and whether or not we're following proper procedures. So that always gets priority. And we've seen this on many occasions in many negotiations. This leads to, again, the differentiation between a procedural matter and a substantive matter. So a procedural matter literally has to do with the process, whether things are allowed to happen in certain order, whether voting procedures are being properly followed, whether election procedures for, say, members of a bureau are being properly followed, all of these types of things that relate back to the steps laid out in the rules of procedure or in the authorization from the, for example, UNEA or any other authorizing body itself will fall under a procedural question, procedural matters. Substantive matters get to the actual topic, the text, the whatever we're trying to address in the treaty. So a substantive matter would be whether or not we include chemicals of concern in a plastics treaty, for example. So something that gets to the heart of what we're trying to do and regulate. And also, finally, one point to bring up is the idea of a high-level segment. A high-level segment is typically ministerial level or their equivalent from for countries, so very limited group of people who are brought together often towards the end of a treaty negotiation with the intention of either, if we think there's about to be a treaty, kind of celebrating it and pushing it forward, or if a negotiation has stalled and there's a feeling like we need to bring people into the room and really gather momentum to do that. So these typically only happen at very critical points in a negotiation process, but they are very important because they do bring together a number of different really high level government actors to talk and to try to figure out whatever the remaining issues might be. The challenge and sometimes the concern about using this is obviously that we have a bit of a transparency issue sometimes in that their meetings are often closed to the general public and certainly closed to observers and stakeholders, but it is often a way that is used to move discussions forward. Now, Shellen, I would like to direct your attention to the screen and have you see
Oh
this
my
lovely photo.
gosh.
Do you remember that? Do you remember that?
Yes, should we tell them who the person is down looking on it on his phone?
You are welcome to narrate, but let me just say that she will always underestimate how powerful a statement she gave. Anyway,
True. I will also I will always underestimate my leadership role in this as well.
yes, indeed.
This right here is the Federation of Russia.
Yes. So you
Oh
grabbed
my
that
gosh.
wasn't in this. Wait, that was not an assigned seat. You grabbed that microphone, right?
No, this was the Children and Youth flag, but I guess
Okay.
it's worth noting that we had 5 minutes notice, so we did not have the intervention written. So I pretty much winged it.
And she winged it beautifully, I must say. It
Oh,
was
thank
lovely.
you. You're
This
so
was in
nice.
Busan. Oh, it's true. This was in Busan, and this is an intervention from the Children and Youth Major Group. So it gets to the point number 2, which I have a typo on. I will fix on the actual slides when they're released, about roles and functions of other groups and coalitions. So we'll do these first. So groups, coalitions, the Children and Youth Major Group, etc., all do have the ability to speak during plenaries. They raise their flags and they're able to speak. Sometimes there's like a list, a short list, because we don't have time for everyone. But they have a very important role, and one of their roles is indeed to really bring the voices of their constituents to the ears of the states in the room, which Shellen did brilliantly for not only for youth, but also for the indigenous communities that had been very actively seeking to speak right before this and having a great deal of pushback on that. But they bring a lot of different viewpoints, they bring a lot of different information and highlight many elements, both legal and technical, as well as societal, that tend not to be brought in as much to a very focused negotiation. So they play a very critical role publicly in terms of interventions. They also play very important roles in terms of providing information. So many groups, myself included, when I'm working with ICN, will provide background papers, briefings, etc., that are made available to negotiators and others participating in the negotiations to provide context, to give them information. often to give like scientific data, etc., so that when countries go in, they have a lot of information available to them. When others go in, they have this type of information. So it can be a really critical role. And I don't just say this working with various groups, but I also say this just because it is a very important gap filler for a lot of information, and also obviously to bring the voices of youth, of children, of women, of indigenous communities, etc., into a negotiation where it may be hard for them to otherwise be present. In terms of regional groups, we mentioned this briefly in the beginning. When we are talking about regional groups, we're not talking about, for example, the African Union or the Organization of American States or ASEAN. What we're talking about is the regional groups that have been recognized by the UN. So the geographic regional groups, so GRULAC, which is Latin America and the Caribbean, um, the African group of negotiators, the Asia Pacific region. Um, we also have Eastern Europe, and we have the name always gets straight, the WeGo entity, which is the Western Europe and others group. So Western Europe, largely Canada and the United States as well. And in addition, we have some other groups that may be recognized depending on the negotiating context, such as the small island developing states, the SIDS, the SIDSs, um, the PSIDS, the Pacific Island, small island states. Sometimes we will have other groups formed throughout, and then they will get their own kind of recognition. So the like-minded coalition, which is a kind of cross geography coalition in the concept of the plastics treaty negotiations. Also, the High Ambition Coalition in the plastics treaty negotiations. Again, cross geography, but still considered to be an entity. And they get their own meeting times. They get their own special meeting venues to meet every day before the negotiations start, and to have open to them as they need. And then members of those groups are also able to give statements during the plenaries and also the contact groups on behalf of all of their membership. So you will often hear a country, Senegal, for example, speaking on behalf of the African group of negotiators. It means that they are the representative who is designated by that group to speak for all of them. That does not preclude the other members of the African group from speaking. It just means that when Senegal is speaking in that capacity, for example, if we're using Senegal, then it is speaking and carrying the voices of all of the member states of that particular group, which can be very powerful. The other thing to point out, since we discussed the work of the groups and coalitions so much already, is the focus on national and regional alliances. And so we do see regional alliances being quite important, even if it is a sub area within a continent or within a geographical grouping. And we also see the role of national alliances, so countries coming together. We see this often in the context of like the High Ambition Coalition or a very larger coalition of countries, but we also see countries that come together, perhaps two or three of them, to work together quite frequently, making proposals. Norway and Rwanda do this a great deal in the plastics context, making proposals for elements that would be in the treaty, or for moving treaty processes forward and negotiations forward as well. So there are a number of different coalitions and alliances that may be created between countries and also within groups as well, to advocate during the treaty negotiations process. This is quite normal, and it's absolutely essential in many ways. And it is also a strategic thing that we all need to think about if anyone is thinking about participating in a treaty negotiation in any way, finding those strategic connections and then figuring out how to make them very valuable throughout the process. Now, this photo is from Bangkok. It is in the middle of the UNEP or buildings in UN or buildings in Bangkok, to give us a bit of a sense of kind of peace and tranquility that we can find every now and then in the middle of a negotiation. But just to get to the understanding of how textual proposals are actually made and who can make a textual proposal and the whole process behind it, because we do get many questions about this, and it's really important to understand in the process of understanding a treaty itself. So textual proposals can come from anyone, can come from a group, can come from a country, etc., outside of the negotiations process. So you can have groups that make proposals that they offer to countries, um, either because the countries have asked or because the groups feel it's important to do so. They put them out in briefing papers, they put them out in advance or even during the negotiations as a document, or they share them with negotiators as a document. But only countries are able to make textual proposals in most negotiations. There are some exceptions to this. There were some exceptions to this um, in the negotiation of some soft law elements, but as a general rule, only countries are able to make textual proposals regarding drafts of the treaty and treaty negotiation text elements. The countries can make them in several ways. They can make oral interventions, they can speak and offer them. They can also put them in, and typically they'll do both. They can put them in to the official record and to be shared and disseminated by the Secretariat, typically by emailing them to the Secretariat, and then the Secretariat will make them available. Non-state participants can be involved in several ways. They can provide guidance, they can provide support on what those textual proposals might mean. They can, as I mentioned, issue briefs, issue papers in advance. They can issue draft text and offer it, and then see if anyone wants to take it up. But it should be highlighted that civil society members, observers, stakeholders, etc., cannot typically make textual proposals. So it would not be possible for CYMG to make an official textual proposal during the negotiations process. You may recommend it and you may support it. You may, if there's a text that you think is particularly valuable, you may support that. But you wouldn't actually make a proposal that then would be reflected in the record as being an option. That is a right that is solely left to the states at this point. And then the question, what happens next? So everyone has come in, they've proposed their text. We have negotiated many rounds through many contact groups and subgroups and late nights that probably go past 10 o'clock. We've had the final plenary and people have agreed. And so we are in possession of a treaty text. What happens next? Are we all done? No, in many ways, actually, the work has only begun. So once this happens, the end of the negotiation process will be a request to say the Director General of the UNEP of the UN Environment Program to convene a diplomatic conference for the official signing of the treaty, and also to consider and, as appropriate, authorize a preparatory committee, potentially for intersessional work, which means that in between the end of the negotiations process and the diplomatic conference, you would have an authorized body that would be able to continue on looking at various issues that might be outstanding before the diplomatic conference. Also preparing just the very nuts and bolts basic elements, preparing the texts that will be agreed to and signed at the diplomatic conference. Making sure that all the translations are properly done, that the Arabic translation matches the Russian translation, which matches the French translation, and the Spanish and the English and Chinese, etc. So making sure that all of the official translations are done properly, and that there is time available for the members to look and see and say, look, I noticed that there's an inconsistency between the French version and the English version, for example. So all of that has to be done. Then we get to the diplomatic conference, which is where we're all hopefully very happy, and it's high level um, members of either the cabinet of a country or presidents or prime ministers themselves who come and formally sign. There are lots of photo ops, etc. They formally sign the treaty on behalf of their states. And then that gets deposited with the UN in New York, where all treaty signatures and ratifications are notified and held. But then we get to the ratification process itself, and the ratification process is essentially one of those very hard to control variables. We would call it probably an independent variable if we were being scientific about it, because it is something that depends entirely on the state. And within a country, there will be their own process. Each country will have its own process for how something is ratified. At home, it can be a very simple process. It can be a very long and drawn out process. This is where we also see political considerations come in at the domestic level, where we might not necessarily have seen them in the same way at the negotiations level. But once we hit the required number of states that are needed to ratify a treaty in order for it to go into effect, and as a reminder, typically in most environmental treaties, that is 50. We've seen 60 used for BB&J, but typically it's 50. But whatever that number is, once we hit that, then officially the treaty will be considered to enter into force. And that will trigger a number of things. It will trigger legal obligations on the states that have already ratified. It will also start triggering the clock to hold the first conference of the parties. And typically it's something like a year after, 6 months, 9 months, a year after the entry into force, the first conference of the parties will be held. And that conference of the parties will be open, obviously, to states that have ratified it and are full member states. And at that point, other states could be present as observers, et cetera, but not until they sign and ratify can they actually be considered member state. But as soon as the entry into force element is triggered, that then triggers preparations and the clock for the first conference of the parties. Now, this could take a great deal of time, depending on how quickly each country that we need to get to that 50 or 60 or whatever that number is ratifies it. It could also be very quick, depending on the pressures, the global pressures, the domestic pressures that exist to ratify. So we don't quite know when this will be, but whenever it happens, this is the process. Number of ratifications required is hit, then we go into, okay, we have to plan for the first COP, which will happen within X amount of time. And then that starts the whole process going. So it is very much an evolving series of work after we've actually negotiated the treaty. Um, but it is important to know these steps so that we can plan for what comes next. And also for both countries, but also civil society members, observers, stakeholders to know what their plans for the future should look like, what their level of engagement should look like after the treaty itself is negotiated, because for many of us, this will be the first step in likely a very long relationship with the treaty. So I will wrap up since we're already over time, and I probably only have time for one or two questions, but just quickly to point out that in this module, we discussed the essential elements of treaty negotiations, and we also discussed terminology used and how negotiations operate in reality, and also the potential that observers and stakeholders have to play a role in the negotiations process. So we did a great deal in a relatively short period of time. I will stop sharing my screen. But thank you all I see many messages, so thank you all. And a reminder that if your question cannot be gotten to today, please don't despair. We will get to it in our later sessions. And also, just because I see the question right in front of me, yes, the recordings of all of these sessions will be available on the YouTube that CYMG has set up, and it's in the chat. So, Shellen, I think I have time probably for one or two questions.
Antonio's been raising his hand very patiently, so we'll let him go.
Antonio, excellent. I know I've seen that hand lingering. Yes, Antonio.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Harry, for the very inspiring lecture today. I have a question, and maybe I'll directly to the plastics treaty.
Mhm.
We might be negotiating a treaty, and it cuts across many sectors and many conventions, particularly the plastic treaty. In UNEP alone, it will cut in UNFCCC. Maybe it's being led by UNFCCC. UNEP cuts across CBD convention. Then it cuts across the Food and Agriculture Organization, World Trade Organization, because plastic is mainly in trade. Then there's United Nations Industrial Development Organization, cuts across UNDP as well. What is the role of all these other UN bodies, and how do they play part in the negotiation of this particular treaty, or are they just observers?
It is such a wonderful question. Thank you, Antonio. So they are observers. They are classified as observers, and they sit with all of us in the observers role. And I think there we go. Did you lose me for a second, Dylan?
Okay.
Okay. My camera dropped, so I wasn't sure. They are observers. So they will sit with us as observers. They will participate as observers in the sense that they will be only able to speak after states. But what they often do is they have the ability to put in information documents. They have the ability to put in conference room papers. So they get a different status in that respect. And they can be asked specific questions. So if, for example, if there's a question that goes to something with FAO and only FAO can answer, then the parties can ask FAO to provide a specific response. They're also able, if they want, to propose treaty text, although they're very unlikely to do so, because again, it's a very political decision as to supporting treaty text. But in the plastics context, the health article that exists, it's in in the compilation document, it was in part 4. It was, I think, Article 8 bis, so Section 8 bis. The health aspects article was actually something that came from the World Health Organization, and then they got a country to help to champion and to get that in. So that's typically how they would work in that respect. But they are present, their voices are considered to be a bit more weighty on the questions that relate to them. So they're definitely present and they definitely participate. But they don't have a different status than the other international organizations or observers.
Thank you. That brings me to my second question. Now, the
Yeah.
plastic treaty has been passed and ratified, and it's now in action. And now we have a dispute. But the dispute cuts across all these organizations. And as discussed, some of them have their own conflict resolution mechanisms before they get to the IC. How does the conflict resolution take place? We have one conflict, but cuts across the many conventions of UN bodies I've mentioned. Some of the UN bodies have their own conflict resolution mechanisms, some don't have. They all depend on how does this go about.
Again, this is thank you. Thank you. And it really is a very nuanced question for what the particular issue is. So if the issue is something to do with the actual implementation of the treaty itself, if it's to do with how the say the COP is making decisions, etc., that will be solely under the jurisdiction of the treaty regime. So there will be an internal mechanism set up, some type of dispute body within the treaty system. And then if that doesn't work, or if there is an agreement there, it will go typically to the International Court of Justice. Although again, this isn't agreed yet. This is all just typically how the treaty proceeding would go. If there's a question of say, trade that relates to plastics, and there's a feeling that it also might have an impact in WTO, that WTO filing could still be made. But then the question would be whether the WTO would feel it appropriate to rule on something that is or is not within its jurisdiction, because its jurisdiction is only the treaties that are under WTO, not outside practices. What we see usually in practice is a great deal of deference by the other organizations to the treaty body itself, and to the treaty regime itself. So there always is the option for cross-cutting choices. But typically it's also, you get one bite at the proverbial apple. So you pick one, right? You pick which one you might think is more favorable, or which one doesn't have anything established yet, so it might be a good place to try, and then we go there. And so you can't, well, you can, but they'll typically get thrown out. You can't really bring, 3 or 4 different complaints under 3 or 4 treaty systems. You pick one and you go from there. But that is a fantastic question. It really is. And if you have more and you want to talk more, I could talk for hours on this topic, so please let me know.
Awesome. Well, I know Alex unfortunately has to go early today. Charles,
I
I'm sorry we didn't get to
do.
your question, but we'll
But
make
Charles,
sure.
we'll start with you.
Yeah, we'll start with you next time. Feel free to add, and thank you guys so much for coming. This session
Yes.
really was insightful and clearly learned a lot. I think we don't really learn this in school, so this is even more exciting.
That's why I like to teach it, because it's stuff you don't learn in school. And I apologize for having to pop out, but I will see all of you hopefully very, very soon, and have a lovely day, evening, rest of the week. Take care. Thank you all. We'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.